I'm Andy Schoenholtz. I teach here at Georgetown Law, and I'm delighted to bring you a panel of experts who will be talking this afternoon about unaccompanied children. Last year, we focused on the movement of children into the United States, and this year we're looking at issues about access to international protection. Obviously, an issue around the world, right? This is not specific to our hemisphere, but it's a common issue with regards to forced migration and the ability of people who are fleeing violence, conflict, persecution to reach safety and be able at some point to rebuild their lives and be protected. So here we're going to be looking at the movement of unaccompanied children from 3 Central American countries to the United States. And we thought this year we'd focus more on changes that have occurred and then some updating today about where we are, because we heard from Secretary Johnson that, in fact, the numbers which came down, the numbers of arrivals of unaccompanied children, which came down last year after there was an influx, as some people call it, they are going back up. So what are the issues going on? What are the factors that matter? And one of the things that brought this to our attention was a report by the Human Rights Institute. Okay, here's the advertisement. I'm the director of the Human Rights Institute. So no conflict of interest per se. I wasn't involved with this, although Professor Podkul was involved with this one, and she'll be talking about this. But this is a report written last year called The Cost of Stemming the Tide, that was written by Georgetown Law students. And there have been other research studies since then. So we want to have a sense of what's going on, particularly with the movement out of these Northern Triangle countries into Mexico, and either issues that have been created at the border point between Mexico and Guatemala, or that have changed since this study was put out. The students were there last January. So let's see what we can learn. We have a great panel to discuss these issues. First to my right is Maureen Meyer, who's a senior associate for Mexico and Migrant Rights at WOLA, and she does advocacy for human rights in the Americas. To her right is Ambassador Reyna Torres Mendivil, who is the Director General for the Protection of Mexicans Abroad in the Ministry of Foreign Relations. And our third panelist is Jennifer Podkul, who is the Senior Program Officer for the Migrant Rights and Justice Program at the Women's Refugee Commission. So I've asked Ambassador Mendivil to begin. Each of the panelists will talk for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll open this up for some Q&A. Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We certainly appreciate the invitation to be here. I have to accept that I'm a bit intimidated to be surrounded by so many lawyers, not being one. So I want to issue a preemptive apology for whatever I'm going to say that probably you may challenge. Many things have happened since we witnessed the phenomenon last year of the sudden, some say, and some others say that, it wasn't as sudden as we thought, increase of flows of unaccompanied minors from Central American countries into the U.S. Certainly it was a challenge for the entire region, and right at the very beginning, the Mexican government took the decision to address this issue following, different objectives. First, it had to be a humane approach, a humane and comprehensive approach. Second, we have to do it under the premise of shared responsibility. It could not be addressed and cannot be addressed only by one actor, whether governmental or non-governmental. It had to engage the entire region, and that was the third objective, to create the tools to address this issue with a regional perspective. And the last one that was particularly important for us is to put into the equation the situation of Mexican minors as well. and not to forget that this was, as I mentioned, a situation that had to be addressed comprehensively, putting precisely the situation of our minors that is, as you know, different from the situation and the legal context of what Central American minors have in the U.S. So we started to do many things when we received this directive, and the first one was to create a protocol or create a tool that will improve the way in which our consular offices conduct interviews of Mexican minors at the border and in different consulates within U.S. territory that go and visit the ORR shelters. We were doing interviews, trying to get information from them if they were treated properly, what their contacts were. We had statistics out of these interviews that will tell us their school grade that they were attending in Mexico, if any, gender, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, that was a very short interview. And we were not be able to address the real context in which those minors were acting or taking the decision, their parents or anybody, any adult, to migrate. We had the phenomenon at the border of these recurring crosses, undocumented crosses. So many of these children are being used by organized crime or other agents or actors for different purposes. It's not it's not the same situation as the Central American minors. They are migrating perhaps under different circumstances, and I'm going to say that for the first time we were announced to the not the possibility, but we tend to try to reunify these minors with their families as our main priority, being government. We thought about these migrant minors as persons that need to be reunified with their families without second thoughts. But for the first time, we took the decision of considering the context of each minor. So not necessarily the best option for them, and not necessarily was in their best interest to be reunified and sent back to Mexico. So that was a major change. As you can imagine, publicly, it could create some questioning to the actions that we were taking, but we were very careful in how we did this. And as I mentioned, we developed a protocol for consular assistance with UNICEF Mexico. And this was, this opened a wide array of positive actions after we did this. For the first time, we have an instrument that is perfectly aligned with international instruments for the protection of minors. Second, it created very positive energy within other governmental agencies in Mexico, to the point that now the Institution for the Protection of Minors in Mexico took the example of our protocol and the way it was drafted and the mechanisms that were put into this instrument, and they created their own that they operate with the National Institute for Migration in Mexico, which is the equivalent to DHS here in the U.S. So both institutions are now applying this new protocol that, as I mentioned, was developed with UNICEF Mexico in the shelters that are operated by both institutions. And in the third place, and which is the topic of this panel, our institution in charge of refuge took this same instrument and is working now with UNICEF Mexico, and actually they are conducting pilot programs to apply new standards to interview the minors in the shelters, so they can fully understand when they are offered the possibility of refuge in Mexico. And we had to overcome many things, and I'm using the protocol as the main conducting line of this presentation, but I'm going to tell you why. The challenges that we faced for granting international protection last year had to do with many things. For example, how do we pass beyond what the traffickers tell the minors to say when they are apprehended by an immigration authority in Mexico? It's very complicated because they are told to say, first of all, that they are Mexicans. so they can be released and then attempt again to go to the northern part of Mexico and cross the border. Second, they are said, they are told that they want, if they, or the authority already knows that they are from Central America, they are told to say that they want to go back to their country so they can attempt again to go to the northern border. And perhaps pay again, to the traffickers. So this is part of the business. So we had to be able to pass beyond that and actually be able to detect when they are not Mexicans, of course, and when they are in need of international protection. And we need the help of, it seems a paradox, but it's true. We need the help of their consular offices, the consular offices of their countries. Many times we received concerns by the civil society because they are in detention centers or shelters for longer than what they should be. And this is complicated because the challenges that our friends of the government of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are quite significant in terms of personnel and resources to be able to go to the immigration centers and interview them and certify their nationality and kind of work with the Mexican authorities to put in place the procedure to take them back to their countries of origin. So this is complicated. And on this front, there is something else that we have done from the Foreign Ministry. We have created a mechanism of sharing good practices with our consular friends and the consular offices from these three countries. We're in that process. And the other thing that, before I forget, I want to mention is that we have put this issue in the core of the Regional Conference on Migration. And with the context of the Regional Conference on Migration that is going to session at the level of vice ministers in the next coming weeks, we have put the issue of the protocols, we have put the issue of sharing good practices and share tools, like real tools, so we can empower and we can increase the capabilities of our friends in the Central American countries. So I was saying the first challenge to grant international protection was to go beyond what the minors, migrant minors are told by the traffickers. Then the consular protection, to have the real assistance from their countries of origin. And third, something that is interesting in Mexico, because we have many NGOs dealing with migration issues, but as opposed to what happens here, we don't have civil society organized with attorneys or with lawyers to assist these minors or migrants in general with the legal procedures in Mexico. So this is something that we have been discussing with many friends in the civil society sector. We would need like migration clinics, we need universities to be engaged and kind of take these cases one by one and help these minors to go through this process. The other thing is the time that they have to wait in the shelters before or while the decision if they were going to be granted protection, refuge or not, have to pass. We're talking about 45 days. That's a lot. And there comes another challenge. We don't have a system like you have here in the U.S. where we can place these persons in the custody of foster families, for example. So they have to stay in the equivalent to our shelters. It's quite complicated to explain to a young person that, you are not in prison, but you cannot go out because we're reviewing your case. So it's a challenge that I think we face in the migration issue that, in general, when we talk about detention. How do we address this issue? Well, the good news is that UNICEF, with the Mexican agency that deals with refuge, are working right now also in a pilot program to address this specific issue. That is not in our law, but we also have to take a look into that. We modify our immigration laws in 2011, and there's room certainly for improvement. We are in the process with the Ministry of the Interior to see in which ways we can target these specific issues that are coming up with this new scenario regarding minors in our territory. So the main goal that we have to achieve is to kind of export this new instrument that is this protocol that we developed with UNICEF. It's going to be put in the context, as I mentioned, of the Regional Conference of Migration. But furthermore, we are in talks with several foundations to sponsor training programs, or all the logistics or kind of resources that our friends in Central America will need to put in place and to implement this new tool. And the beauty of this is that now that we're going to pay more attention in the needs of the minors, not in the process, but the person, and that now that we're going to implement this instrument that, as I mentioned, is aligned with international tools for the protection of human rights, we are going to have better data and better statistics. Part of the questionnaire that is applied as part of the protocol is going to throw figures that will allow us to develop public policies specifically for this segment of the population. And more importantly, it's not only for Mexican minors, it's for minors of the entire region. So we are talking about midterm and long-term goals. This is kind of an organic process. We need to perfect it as we are implementing. We have seen already with the pilot program that our Agency for Refuge is implementing, we have seen an increase in the applications or in the requests for refuge. So that's good news. Now that we are explaining the minors according to their age, their gender, and their specific circumstances, the possibility to receive international protection, they are reacting positively. I have more information, but I want to stop here to allow for the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think we'll then move to Maureen with your presentation.
Thank you. Make sure I stay on time. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and it's great to share the panel. I wanted to take a step a little bit back. You had mentioned, Andy, earlier, looking at what has changed in the past, I think in the past year in particular, and Secretary Johnson, again, spoke this morning about numbers changing. I think just take a snapshot of where we are right now in terms of what's happened at the U.S. border, but mostly what we review is what's mostly changed, which is what's happened in Mexico, which Reyna also touched on a little bit. And I just wanted to start with a few numbers, which is looking at Mexico's apprehensions of Central Americans. This is month by month that my colleague had put together, but certainly shows, if you look at the last few months, or 2014 onward, that Mexico's rapidly increased the apprehensions of Central Americans. Or this is actually just from the Northern Triangle countries, so we're talking about Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. I was looking at the just recent numbers, and between October 1st, 2014, in August of this year, looking at both numbers from CBP and Mexico's immigration agency, Mexico has apprehended 19% more Central Americans in general than the United States. And so certainly when we look at our border and less attention on the border, I think it's a lot because Mexico has taken on this role. I'm just going to go through. These are the main numbers for apprehensions of citizens from the Northern Triangle. The green is the United States and blue is Mexico from 2014, and then up to this part of 2015, it goes up through August because that's the numbers we have for Mexico. For children, it's not as dramatic. I think this is for Central American, unaccompanied Central American children. You can certainly see the U.S. continues to apprehend more than Mexico, actually, but Mexico's apprehensions have almost doubled from that. I think our reasoning with the children is that I think a lot of children are not traveling by themselves. They're certainly, as Reyna said, a lot of times with smugglers. It increases your chances of getting to your final destination, but there are several children that are certainly being apprehended in Mexico. I wanted to look at, where the U.S. is engaging with Mexico on these issues, some concerns we have about it, and looking at also what's going on in Central America. And I think it's important to really look at what has changed. And so, as many of you may know, last July, the Mexican President Peña Nieto had announced what's called the Southern Border Program, which, I think is important to specify. We were just down there in July, and a lot of things that the Mexican government has framed under this program are actually things they were already doing on the ground. There's lots of checkpoints in southern Mexico for security reasons. The U.S. has engaged with them on border security for recent years. But what we did see different, or what has changed, is one, the Mexican government's decision to make it very difficult or almost impossible for migrants to ride the trains, particularly in southern Mexico. I would say the state of Chiapas and Tabasco, where they have made more guards on the train or more raids. The area last year, which Arriaga, the city in Chiapas where you would have 1,000 migrants a day at its peak, we were there in July and it was empty in terms of Central Americans. And that was the train station, the sort of starting off point for many of the migrant families and migrants coming north. And it's a lot because of increased enforcement. There are more immigration agents that have been stationed in southern Mexico. I think it's between 300 and 600 that have been moved to southern Mexico. And we saw a lot more increase in what they call volantes, roving checkpoints, so checkpoints that are not stable checkpoints but are set up on the highways at different times. So I think it's the results I think we've seen in these numbers in Mexico taking on this role as increased in enforcement as compared to the previous years. And I think as it's engaged with the United States, there's sort of two parts of this, which is one, the U.S. Very happy and enthusiastic about Mexico's efforts. It was very clear when President Obama met with Mexican President Peña Nieto in January that he had stated, I very much appreciate Mexico's efforts in addressing unaccompanied children that we saw spike during the summer. And in part because of strong efforts from Mexico, including at their southern border, we've seen these numbers reduced back to what he termed manageable levels at ours. And I think we continue to see that. We believe, and I think others, that there is no direct, we can't find any direct that says the U.S., pressured Mexico into doing increased enforcement, but it is very clear that there was, this is helping the United States. This was, I would guess, a petition in terms of working together to address Central American migration. But we have a lot of concerns about how it's taking place. I think Jen's going to touch on some of that before. I think, though, it's important to even talk about what the U.S. is doing in Mexico. You may have seen an article Sonia Nazario had written in the New York Times a few weeks ago about the U.S. funding Mexico on this. And it's important to kind of get a detail of what that really looks like and what does this mean in southern Mexico. So most of the assistance is through what's called the Mérida Initiative. It's U.S. foreign aid. It's a security package that started in 2008 and to date has allocated $2.5 billion to Mexico. There is a pillar of the assistance that is termed Building a 21st Century Border. This is traditionally focused on the U.S.-Mexico border, on infrastructure and other projects. It is moving more and more to Mexico's southern border. The main purpose is to facilitate legitimate commerce and movement of people while curtailing the illicit flow of drugs, people, arms, and cash. And so when I say we've seen it shift more to southern Mexico, we've seen the U.S. supporting these broad infrastructure projects. There are these integrated customs centers that have the customs agency, federal police, military, and the immigration agencies all in one kind of place in different checkpoints in southern Mexico. You can't basically travel out of the border of Chiapas without stopping in one of the main highways in these revision centers. The U.S. has supported that. They have supported the immigration agency in Mexico. Again, hard to track the specific numbers. We know a few years ago that they had received over $100 million in assistance, mostly focusing on biometric kiosks, these equipment for biometrics, to support for vetting Mexico's immigration agents. Mexico's an evaluation system, this control de confianza. It's like a vetting system, and so support for that. And training and equipment for Mexico's Grupo Beta, which are, I guess they would compare to the Borstar in the U.S. in terms of the agents in charge with providing humanitarian assistance for migrants and assisting migrants in distress. There's a lot positioned at the U.S. border with Mexico, but there's several that also operate in 5 different parts of Chiapas and other parts of southern Mexico. And it's important to say that the Defense Department also supports Mexico's military in southern Mexico. It's harder to track the amount of money that has been for, but it's clear it has going on. The head of the Northern Command for the Department of Defense told the Senate this March that they have received a request from Mexico to begin assisting in their efforts on Mexico's southern border. And so I think there is, more and more U.S. military engagement with Mexico on southern border issues. What we have tracked is this goes from non-intrusive scanning equipment, basically big X-ray machines that you can use primarily to scan drugs and other illicit goods, but you can also find people using that equipment, to helicopters and patrol boats, information technology, and then a lot of workshops and training, particularly focused on detecting human smuggling and trafficking networks, and more looking at gang activity in southern Mexico. When we are there, there's a very clear FBI training of Mexico's federal police looking at some of the gang activity. It's very difficult, though, to get a full sense of where this is or where it's going in terms of the exact amounts per program or where it is all going. What is clear is that the U.S. Congress is very interested in this issue. They provided $68 million in assistance to Mexico in this past fiscal year, above what the Obama administration actually requested, to include additional support for securing Mexico's southern border. And so I think from Congress, we've seen lots of statements made of the need to continue to shift U.S. assistance to more and more looking at border security. And as I said, I think while a lot of the focus has been traditionally framed as stopping interdicting drugs and somewhat other illicit goods, it's clear that from statements we've seen from administration officials that the U.S. also has an intention of supporting Mexico and stopping migrants from reaching the U.S. border. I think one of the clearest statements was made by Ambassador Tom Shannon, who's a counselor to the State Department, who said last summer to the Senate that one of the objectives of U.S., the part of their 5-point strategy for engaging and addressing unaccompanied migrant children from Central America was working to improve the ability of Mexico and Guatemala to interdict migrants before they cross into Mexico and enter the established smuggling routes that move migrants to our border. So I think in terms of expressed intention, this is Tom Shannon's statement. The White House press secretary said last August something similar, of working with both countries to interdict migrants. They also mentioned a program that I think is worth talking about, which is a Honduran Special Operations Police that the U.S. had actually worked to fund with International Narcotics Assistance and CBP. It's called Rescue Angels, Operation Rescue Angels, along the Honduran and Guatemalan border, which was basically stopping Hondurans from leaving the country. And it was designed to increase apprehensions of migrants that were trying to get to the United States, but mostly stopping them at their own borders. And there was a case that we highlighted last week in an Inter-American Commission hearing on interdictions of a migrant woman who wanted to leave with her son and was told that they could not leave because he didn't have his father's permission. But again, prohibiting people that may have valid claims for international protection from actually leaving their country. And I just kind of wanted to briefly talk about Central America, because I think if we're talking about addressing flows and what's going on, we really need to focus on what's happening on the ground in Central American countries. And I think, excuse me, the numbers show that both the sort of uptick in apprehensions that we've seen at the U.S. border in recent months and the fact that Mexico's apprehension numbers continue to be high certainly suggest that a lot of people are still fleeing from the Northern Triangle countries. The situation on the ground doesn't appear to have changed. I would say, in fact, it's gotten worse. El Salvador's homicide rate keeps gradually going up every month, and it's higher than it's been since the country ended its civil war in 1992. You have continued families. When we were in Chiapas in July, we heard a lot of entire families, like not just nuclear families, but the grandmothers going, the 17 family members all at once leaving their country, fleeing because of extortion, displacement. I think the fact that even as we look at the Northern Triangle region, the fact that other countries beyond the United States, meaning Mexico, Panama, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, have received requests it's increased by 1,200%, the amount of requests that these countries have received since 2008 for refugee protection. If you are leaving Honduras to go to Nicaragua, which has a similar economic situation, not a very wealthy place, you're obviously not going there for economic reasons. And so I think what we're seeing more and more is this population from Central America that should be considered refugees. I spoke to a shelter worker yesterday in Tenosique, which is Tabasco, so very close to the border with Guatemala, who they are starting to refer to their shelter as a refugee camp because there's so many people coming. They've received 10,000 people so far this year, and a lot of Central Americans who don't know where else to go. And they're at that point, and what do we do now? Do we stay in Mexico? Where else can we go? And I think so you're certainly looking at an ongoing crisis in these Northern Triangle countries that is probably not going to go away anytime soon, but which also needs a lot more international support and engagement. And I think on that, it's clear that the Obama administration requested 3 times what the current assistance is to Central America. This past February, they requested $1 billion in assistance to Central America. That was a much broader request of aid than what we had seen previously, which was mostly focused on Central American security. There was a Central American Regional Security Initiative, which is basically the bulk of all U.S. assistance. This new request includes economic development projects, looking at good governance, and then certainly the security side. What we also know is that Congress is not as enthusiastic about funding this as the administration would like. The House approved just $296 million in assistance, all for security. And the Senate has approved a much higher amount, $675 million, and a more comprehensive approach. But as we all know with our Congress, it's still not been approved, and we have not a clear sense yet of where the foreign assistance aid bill will go this year. What is important is that this is very much an increased engagement in Central America. The Central American governments themselves, the three Northern Triangle countries developed with the IDB what is called the Plan for the Alliance for Prosperity, which is also kind of their idea of where they would like support to go, where they have requested support from the international community, including the United States. And I think just to underscore that any of this sort of funding, that the situation isn't going to change just by money. What needs to change is more looking at how those funds are directed to agencies in these countries that have the political will to really tackle these very difficult problems. And I think it's looking at how do you fund effective violence prevention programs, how do you do targeted employment training and job creation programs in areas that are known to be where young people are leaving or where you have at-risk youth, to building the capacity and accountability for the judiciary system in these countries. Guatemala has a very important example through the International Commission to Combat Impunity in Guatemala, looking at how do you work with that and how that has worked to strengthen their own judiciary. So there's a lot of ongoing problems, but I think it's also really important to see the U.S. continue to be engaged both in Central America, then also figuring out how to better work with Mexico on this issue, which should include much more a focus on protection than just on the security. And I will let Jen talk more about that, I think.
Thank you, and thank you, Andy, for including me in this important conversation. I think what's really interesting about all this attention now that is on Mexico and not just solely on the U.S. southern border is that we're all recognizing Mexico is going from being a country of transit to a country of destination where people want to go and want to stay and want to seek protection. And so that really means that the Mexican southern border really has to have a protection-sensitive response to all those people that are coming. And Mexico, as my colleague mentioned, has very strong new laws designed to protect migrant children. They have incredibly progressive laws that outline specific protections for migrant children, and they're designed to ensure that they have access to international legal protection. Now, unfortunately, several studies, including the one Andy mentioned by the HRI Institute here, identified several ways in which Mexico is not implementing all of the protections that they have on their books. For example, children are still being arbitrarily detained, and the length and condition of detention is deterring them from even asking for asylum. Not all children are being informed of their right to seek asylum or apply for a humanitarian visa. And finally, some of the child protection officers are still not conducting best interest determinations as they're required to do under law. And these shortcomings in implementation not only violate Mexico's domestic laws, but they're counter to several international human rights principles, including freedom from arbitrary detention, the concept of the best interest of the child, non-refoulement, and family unity. And these principles are enshrined in international human rights instruments, which Mexico has signed and ratified. We've been very pleased to see some new developments. One, which my colleague mentioned, with the collaboration of UNICEF and Comar, really trying to ramp up their ability to screen and talk to children and inform them of their right to seek protection in Mexico. The other pilot I wanted to mention is through the International Detention Coalition. They've been given the green light to set up an alternative to detention shelter care program in Mexico City so that children who are applying for asylum can stay in a place where they're not going to be detained or locked in somewhere, and they would have a little bit more freedom of movement. I think what we would like to see is that Mexico eliminates the prolonged detention of migrant children and implements these ATT programs in other parts of the country, particularly on the southern border. I think we would love to see the DEEF capacity to expedite the transfer of children from the immigration stations into the DEEF shelters as quickly as possible when a child is identified. and that DEEP allows children to be able to leave their shelters in order to go to school or integrate a little bit more in the community while they're staying in the DEEP shelters. We'd like to see Comar's capacity increased, of course, to ensure that all apprehended child migrants are informed of their right to seek protection and that they can screen all the children. We would like to see more numbers of child protection officers who are tasked with screening children and implementing best interest determination procedures and ensuring safe repatriation when that is necessary. We would like to see amendment of the screening procedures outlined in the immigration regulations and the new child welfare law to require screening for all children, not just unaccompanied children, because as we know, there are many children who are traveling with a parent or legal guardian. And finally, we would like to ensure access for civil society to go in and provide screening and assistance to the children who are detained either in the INAMI shelters or in the DEEP shelters. And as we know, not all children are being apprehended in Mexico, and there are still thousands of children who are arriving at the U.S. border in search of protection. This past fiscal year, almost 40,000 unaccompanied children were apprehended by CBP, which was down from last year's peak of 68,000. And I would also like to note that it's almost the exact same numbers for family units, so that's children traveling with their parents. And similarly to Mexico, the U.S. over the past year has continued on the path of dealing with these children as a border management issue instead of as a refugee population needing protection. Over the past year, I have witnessed the government rhetoric change slightly in recognition that this is predominantly a refugee flow, but policy has not kept up with the shift in rhetoric. The policies put in place to deal with this population continues to be about deterrence and deportation, not about protection and due process. Last year, we were all very troubled by the images of children languishing in Border Patrol stations. And although the numbers continue to be incredibly high, CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who's tasked with housing the unaccompanied children here in the U.S., have improved their procedures to get children out of CBP custody back into more appropriate ORR shelters in a timely manner. Now, in order to do so, CBP and ORR have improved the communications between the two agencies and their systems with ICE, who does the transfers, to more efficiently move the children to ORR. And ORR has expedited the process in which they reunify children. Now, of course, getting children out of detention as quickly as possible is something that I would like to see, but we must make sure that any expedited procedures are sufficient and ensure reunification is safe and will result in a safe placement for a child. There have been expedited court procedures. EOR has implemented expedited court procedures for recent arrivals, so women traveling with their children, so children accompanied and also unaccompanied children. These cases have been fast-tracked. So the hope was that quick and high-profile removals would serve as a deterrence to those who have not yet made the journey. And I must say the result has been disastrous, particularly for unaccompanied children. Unaccompanied children are likely to change court jurisdictions at least once due to their unification process, and now an incredibly high number of children are missing court dates and receiving in absentia orders, despite a desire to comply with the court process because they are eligible for legal forms of relief. These expedited proceedings are violating the children's right to due process. Expedited court procedures are also frustrating a child's ability to obtain an attorney and represent them in court. The need for an attorney to represent a child in court cannot be overstated. It is nearly impossible for a child to successfully represent themselves in a complex adversarial court case without the assistance of an attorney. The government has gone to great lengths to increase representation of unaccompanied children, both for attorneys and the use of child advocates, through grants through the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the Justice AmeriCorps program to provide direct representation to the children. So we've been very happy to see that. But despite these advances, more than 70% of unaccompanied children are still going to court without an attorney. And the Department of Justice is strenuously fighting a court case, arguing that they should not have to provide counsel to all children in removal proceedings. Another area in which there has been a great deal of change over the past year is on the issue of detention. The government has reinstated the practice of detaining children who are traveling with their parents. And family detention was designed to send a message to would-be asylum seekers that if they come here seeking protection, they will be summarily detained and deported. The government has spent the past year defending itself in a legal challenge on the conditions of detention for children. The attorneys from the Flores settlement have alleged, and a federal judge agreed, that the conditions in both CBP facilities and family detention facilities did not comply with the court settlement. We have been very disappointed that instead of working to find a better way to process these children while their claims are being adjudicated, the government has vigorously defended its practices. And finally, the U.S. government continues to spend millions of dollars on a do not migrate advertisement campaigns designed to dissuade a child from making the dangerous journey to the United States. I don't think there is anyone in this room from the government or from civil society who would want a child to undertake such a dangerous journey, or who wouldn't want a child to be able to remain in their own home, in their own community, contributing to their own country. But it's unrealistic to think that a child who believes they will die if they stay will be persuaded by a catchy radio spot to stay where they are. I believe the U.S. should spend its resources on working on regional solutions, especially the ways in which the U.S. and Mexico can work together to find permanent solutions for children and families crossing borders in search of safety. They must seek creative solutions to find ways to ensure the best interest of the child is considered for any children seeking international protection. The United States must support Mexico and the Northern Triangle with aid that is focused on strengthening civil society and justice reform to ensure that children can stay in their homes and in their own communities. We must focus financial and logistical support on humanitarian protections, not solely on law enforcement and border management. And finally, we must ensure that our own government agencies are sufficiently funded to screen, care for, and provide due process to children arriving at our border. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jen. So you've heard a few different perspectives and sets of information about unaccompanied children coming from 3 Central American countries. The push factors are still there in significant ways. And I recall last year hearing directly from a U.S. government representative about the change in the demographics of the children who were coming. In the past, before the numbers increased, as I recall, the average age was maybe 16, and it was more dominated by boys. And all of a sudden, last year and building up to it, it shifted. And we started seeing that there were more girls. The average age was 13 to 14. Anybody have any ideas what was going on? What's led to that sort of change? And Reyna, I don't know if you have information about what the Mexican government's able to develop with regards to the children that the Mexican government encounters, but is it similar there as well? This is U.S. government official data.
I'm just looking at the figures, and I don't see what you're saying. Certainly throughout the last decade, we have seen an increase in the group of minors between the age of 0 and 11 years old.
Right.
But we don't see a dramatic shift in the figures in last year. And same regarding gender. Actually, it's pretty constant, the amount. Of course, now we have more girls than males, but not in a dramatic way. I mean, it's certainly an increase, but not a dramatic increase.
Just for clarification, are you saying there's more than half of the children encountered
Still
are
not
girls?
Yet. For example, let me give you an example. In 2014, the amount of females were 8,248, and males were 14,830.
Okay.
Which is more or less what we saw the previous year, in 2013.
Okay. Anybody have any ideas about the change that's taken place that in terms of those who've made it to the United States last year? This was a statement made in early July of 2014.
So made last year.
Yeah, made last year.
I mean, my I think there's different factors that have led to the change in demographics. I really do think, though, it's mostly getting more details about what's actually happening on the ground. If you are a 13-year-old girl in El Salvador in a gang-controlled community and some gang member decides that they like you, your options become very, very limited very quickly in terms of what you can do in that situation. And so I think that has probably led to, in terms of girls, that's one factor. There's a lot of concern about domestic violence and interfamilial violence in Central America. And so I think it's sort of hard to see where, what would be, I think there's not one specific reason, but I do think particularly just gang activity and targeting more and more even younger and younger boys to be recruited has led to, I think, sort of what you may see could be a drop, because you see 10-year-olds being recruited to work as lookouts, et cetera. So I think it is certainly kind of that part of it.
Okay, we're going to open this up to questioning in just a moment. So please, I guess we'll set up the mics, if you would. That would be great. Anybody who wants to comment on the shift that's taken place in terms of what was obviously a lowering of the numbers, as it sounded like the Mexican enforcement on the southern border with Guatemala stepped up, and now an increase again in the number of arrivals being apprehended by the U.S. Border Patrol. Any ideas?
I mean, the one thing I think I can say is, you open any newspaper and you can hear what's going on in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And so I don't think, if you correlate what's going on in those countries with the numbers that we're seeing, I don't think it's any surprise that the numbers are going up a little bit. And I think the other thing we have to keep in mind is everyone's saying, well, this year the numbers are less. I mean, this past year, it was still 40,000. I mean, for years, the number was between 6,000 and 8,000 unaccompanied kids who arrived here, and it was steady for years. I mean, the fact that we're still at 40,000, the numbers that Mexico has apprehended are still astronomical. And so I don't think there's probably that much shift in who's trying to leave and who's trying to seek safety. I think it's more about where people are getting caught up in the process and where they're being stopped. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So we'll start with questions first on this side. If you, again, please identify yourself, and if you're directing your question to any particular panelist, let them know. Otherwise, we'll keep it open. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Ryan. I'm the executive director of Raíces, and we provide legal services to many unaccompanied children in Texas. Regarding the increase in the number of girls, I would throw in most vulnerable populations there has been an increase of. And I think very similar to the fact that we've seen fracking become a big deal in the United States when the price of oil went high enough to make it worth it. I think a similar calculation is at play. It's a sign of exactly how bad the violence has become in these countries, that the calculation of the danger of the journey has been changed. It is now more dangerous to stay than to go. It's very simple. I have a brief question as well. It's a little off topic, but I think it's interesting. You talk about the interdiction effort as being a collaboration between the U.S. and narcotics services in Mexico. Have we seen any demonstrable change in the amount of narcotics coming across the border as a result of these $2 billion that have been spent?
I'd have to look at the more recent numbers. You may.
I haven't noticed a change.
Well, I'm just going to have to clarify some things. I mean, there is no correlation between the operations or the collaboration that we have between our law enforcement in terms of combating drug trafficking with this. I think that's a huge and a very misleading opinion that has been put in several papers. The money is hard to track because there has not been specific money provided to the Mexican immigration authorities in the last years to do this. That's why it's difficult to track, because INAMI has not seen their budget increased in the last year, so they will conduct this operation. So I think that the question I cannot answer, because there's no correlation between one thing or the other. It's not that the United States is providing more cooperation in this field, and putting this in the same basket as what we have seen in the cooperation for drug trafficking. The program that has been put in place to target the several challenges that we face in the southern border. It has to do with many things, including providing people that work, perhaps live in Guatemala and work in Mexico with new cards so they can be identified and they cannot be stopped by authorities in the southern states, so they can say, I'm a worker here in this country. And we have seen an enormous increase in those cards from those cards that we issued the year before 2013 and 2014. On the other hand, as you know, the INAMI, or our migration authorities, is not a law enforcement armed corps. It's an administrative police. So there are many also misleading statements that would say that, they are carrying weapons and guns and they threaten with tasers immigrants. They don't carry tasers, they don't carry guns. So we cannot make that automatic comparison between enforcing the laws regarding drug trafficking and immigration. It's actually kind of misleading. And as I said, this program that has to do with the southern border refers to many other things. Of course, as I said, there are challenges. For example, since this program has been implemented, close to 600 persons have been apprehended with charges of human trafficking, and 60 already have been put in jail with a sentence for this crime. That's something different. This is not, once again, put in the same basket as the efforts that we are conducting with the U.S. regarding combating drug trafficking.
Thank you.
Can I think add to that, though?
Go ahead,
I think
Maureen.
you are very right that the INM is not a security force, which is my understanding why they have, within the immigration law, the federal police has the capacity to assist them in their operations. And if you look at the way shelters are working and documenting cases in Mexico, it's very clear that there's lots of joint operations where it is the immigration agency that is doing the apprehension, that you do have police agents assisting in different operations. And so I think when we are looking at U.S. assistance, there is U.S. funding to Mexico's federal police, and there's equipment, for example, on scanning equipment that is primarily for a drug focus, but you could certainly use it for inspections for other things, including people.
Okay, thank you for your question. Jonathan?
Thank you.
Yes, my name is Jose Diaz. I'm the correspondent for Reforma newspaper from Mexico here in Washington. So I have two questions. One for Jennifer and Maureen. Considering the limitations in terms of resources and the size of the crisis that Mexico is facing at the southern border, what's the single most important action that the Mexican government can take at this moment? Is it in terms of detention, or what exactly we need to do? And a second question for Ambassador Torres, can you clarify what you were talking about, the change of the reunification principle in Mexican policy? Are you referring to Mexican migrants in the U.S. or Central American migrants in Mexico? And the Human Rights Institute report of April was really staggering, and it mentioned very clearly that Mexico was in breach of its international obligations in terms of human rights protections. Do you fear that Mexico could face some kind of legal action, for example, at the Inter-American system because of this issue?
Thank you, Jose. Who would like to begin first? Jennifer? Maureen, it's up to you.
I mean, I can quickly say, I think I would reiterate what I said before, is that, we would like to be able to see Mexico as really kind of a key piece in this entire region to expand its ability to offer protection in its own country and fully implement their own laws. So make sure that when there are people who want to stay there, they have the opportunity to make their case. If people want to move on, I think that's a more complicated issue, and that requires much more collaboration between governments, depending on where somebody wants to end up, where somebody's family member is. But I think if Mexico can realize the expansive protection that they are offering in their own country, I think a lot of people would be a lot safer.
Mm-hmm. And I would agree with Jen on that. But I think more specifically, it's how do you expand COMAR's capacity, so the refugee agency, which, if I remember correctly, has 15 agents in the country right now determining cases. So how do you increase that capacity? Also, how do you increase INM's capacity to better screen migrants that are being detained? So in the detention centers, I think this study, as well as the Inter-American Commission in their report, had said I think over 60% of the migrants either didn't understand what they were being informed or weren't clear on what they could actually receive protection in Mexico. So certainly both with the refugee agency, but also within the INM, because in a lot of cases that's the only agency that migrant is going to be in touch with. How do you make sure that those agents have that capacity to better screen people, which is tough when you have a very small agency and very tight budget right now.
So did you say 15 agents at Comar, the refugee agency? So what do we have now in the, and I'm not trying to say that this should be the same as the U.S. asylum system. How many asylum officers do we have now? Any of my asylum officers who are out there know the number now?
About 470.
470? And how many asylum seekers a year do we have? Approximately who are being interviewed by those asylum officers? Tens of thousands? How many? 70,000, okay. And you're talking about how many children? 20. It was 14 and 8, 22,000, 23,000, and 15 agents.
In 2014, they received 2,137 applications.
Right. Okay. So among the children, there were that many applications. So 15 agents. That's
in general, not only children.
Those are overall.
In general. All right. For the entire refugee program. Right. And I got you. Okay. So that's definitely a serious challenge in terms of access to international protection. How else are decisions made on international protection in the Mexican context if somebody, out of those 2,000 claims, of people assert asylum claims?
I couldn't agree more with both of my colleagues here in the panel. As I mentioned, there are several challenges that we are facing in this field, but what is most important is that we're addressing them in a comprehensive manner. Once again, I don't want to sound repetitive, but that's the way we want to do it, and I think that's the correct way to do it, not addressing just one phase of this issue, but all the different dimensions. It's a multi-dimensional phenomenon, so that's the way we should be looking into it. Certainly, all our institutions need to work, including the Foreign Ministry, and we're doing so, need to work in trying to increase our capabilities to be more efficient in this field. But what I find really interesting is that we are finding that the collaboration with UNICEF is changing completely the way in which we are doing business in regarding this issue. And to address the question that was mentioned before, because it's related to this, it's not that we are not reunifying families. We do that all the time. I mean, and that is part of our job, and particularly in the area that I look from the Foreign Ministry. That's one of the principles that we try to follow. But regarding exclusively minors, what we're trying to do now is to see beyond that and to see into the best interest of the minor. Sometimes those minors are under the risk of being reunified with a family that is not in the conditions to receive them. Perhaps they have someone in dealing with addictions, or a family member is in jail. So what we're trying to do now is to look for what is the best for this minor. For example, when we talk about menores de circuito and this young kids that are at the border and cross on a regular basis, the U.S. have been implementing a program called the Juvenile Referral process or program, where these kids are taken into custody of immigration authorities, and they are put into our facility and spend there supposedly 3 months, but we have had cases in which they have been for how long? Almost a year? Yeah, just completely, irregular. But what we're trying to do now is to see if those kids, for example, may have a possibility of seeking any other option here in the U.S. Perhaps they have a relative here in the U.S. that can, with whom they can reunify instead of going back to Mexico, because we don't know if their parents are forcing them or are part of the network that is putting them to work in trafficking with other minors, for example, or trafficking with substances, or any other irregular activity. That's the kind of thing that we're doing now. And one of the key elements to do this and to look into the best interest of the child is one thing, align all our processes to the international human rights standards and instruments. But the other thing is to explain to them, whether it's our consular network, COMAR, INAMI, or the National Institute of Migration, or DIF, our social services institution, to explain to the minors according to their mind frame, their circumstance, their age, their gender, what options do they have. So that's the main shift, the main change, so putting the person in the center and not of our attention and not the process.
Thank you. You've been patient. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Amanda Bergson-Chilcock. My question is for either Jennifer or Maureen, and it has to do with trauma. 5 years ago, I was running a high school program at a large public high school in Philadelphia. We had a student who was falling asleep in his first period class. When we got to know him, we realized it was because he had come alone to the United States at age 15. He was working in a restaurant, 7 p.m. to 2 a.m., washing dishes. And he had, shortly before coming to the United States, witnessed the death of his younger sister. And I'm wondering what the new knowledge that we have as a field around trauma-informed care and trauma-informed systems, what does that have to say for students like this who made it through the process, or for those who are still in the process, have been identified as unaccompanied minors, are in detention right now, are released with family members? What can we as a field do or respond based on what we're learning around trauma and what we know many of these young people have endured?
Thank you for that incredibly important question. I think I'm going to have a two-part answer. The first part is, something we've been gravely concerned about is that a lot of those issues of trauma, and if a child is even able to articulate that they want protection or need protection, suffering what many of these children suffer through prohibit them from being able to open up about it right away. The current process we have in the U.S. is that in order to be able to stay here and exercise that, they would have to tell perhaps the Border Patrol agent who just apprehended them in the desert that they're scared and why they're scared. So I think a lot of my work has been talking to the government about, can we think of a better way of doing the screening and make sure it's not just what kinds of questions we're asking these kids, but also who's doing the asking, right? Making sure that it's done in a trauma-informed way. I think the other part is that we don't know a lot about what's happening to children once they leave ORR custody, and I think there's been a real dearth in research on this topic. I think people are starting to ask more questions about it because we need to be arming our schools with what they can do and what these children need, because sometimes those are going to be the only people who see these kids and who would have access to them and have some sort of connections to social services that we can provide for them. Because the thing is, a lot of these kids, the court cases, even though their initial hearings are expedited, as I talked about, these court cases might go on for years. And in those years, those children are living in our community, and a large percentage of them, particularly if they're represented, are winning their cases, meaning they're eventually going to be U.S. citizens. And so these people are going to be us very soon, and so we need to make sure we're taking care of our own children. So I thank you for raising that question. I don't have a lot of good answers for you, but I think if we can spend more time looking at what these kids need while they're in that limbo process, I think we can go a long way to protecting them.
Thanks, Jen. And now my colleague who needs no introduction whatsoever, Doris Meisner.
I thought I would introduce myself.
Go right ahead, Doris.
I'm going to break the rules here a little bit and put you on the spot, Andy.
It's about time. I was expecting you to do that.
Because, Andy, you're as much of an expert here as everybody knows on these issues as people on the panel. And so I really would like to draw you into this discussion with this question. It's clear when you look at what we've all looked at in terms of what's happened over the last year, that if you put Mexico and the United States together, we are witnessing exactly the same phenomenon that we witnessed a year and a half ago. So the things that the U.S. government and working with other governments in the region had hoped would change, you have to conclude from what we can see on the evidence, haven't changed. Mm-hmm. And there's a good reason to think that much of it is getting deeper and worse, particularly the fact that the murder rate in El Salvador now peaks all of them, even Honduras. So the statement was made that this has been treated as an issue of border management, not an issue of refugee protection. First, do you agree with that? Secondly, if it were defined as an issue largely of a refugee flow and refugee protection, recognizing mixed flows and recognizing the importance of border management, what would be things that you, as an expert in this field, would put on the table that we should all be thinking about? What are the bigger things we should be thinking about? For instance, there's been no mention in this panel of in-country processing. Yeah. That's one of the things that has been tried. But if you look at this as a year to a year and a half's first-tier responses, and we're now assessing them and trying to figure out where we're at, because this is a continuum, what should we be talking about beyond what we've talked about?
Thanks for the easy question, Doris. This was not a setup, just to let you know. But seriously, thanks, because this will move this discussion into, I think, a really productive area. So I do see this as a protection and access to international humanitarian protection set of issues. Why? Because of the causes, some of the major causes of flight. The violence is significant. Any of you who've actually done individual cases and understand the details of this, understand what the dangers are to the girls and boys who are trying to escape this. So here are the variety of complications. It's going to take a significant period of time for Mexico in itself, understandably, to build up a protection system. It does not have one in place. Normally, what's done in those situations, in countries that do not have a protection system in place, that is the processing, or I'll throw another idea out, temporary protection schemes in place to allow the children to be in safety and to live with dignity, call on the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to step in those situations. And they often, sometimes they help adjudicate cases. Sometimes they're there to help set up a reception, if you will, and help register children or other asylum seekers. So I think there's a serious role for UNHCR in this regionally. It is a regional situation. You've heard people fleeing to Nicaragua and other surrounding countries, and we really need to develop a better regional response. What's most disturbing to me, though, is the U.S. Response at this point. Compared to what's going on in the rest of the world, where there are serious crises, just horrible crises taking place, the numbers here are not significant. And we should not be responding to this in any way other than it is a humanitarian situation. And there are ways to deal with that. With respect to some of the unaccompanied children, if they happen to come from countries other than Mexico or Canada, then they do have some access to a protection system with some challenges that we face because the numbers increased and our government was not prepared for that increase, though they had a sense it was coming because it had grown over the years. But there are ways, it seems to me, to help build that ability. And I'm throwing out the idea of temporary protection as a stand-in for some period of time until an asylum system is put into place. What does temporary protection accomplish? It's a group protection system, effectively. It recognizes that this cohort of people is fleeing from very serious violence. Some of them may be refugees who are being persecuted on account of one of the 5 grounds. Some of them may be fleeing horrendous violence, and the nexus isn't there for those of you who are into the weeds of asylum law, right? But they're fleeing violence. That's true also with the Syrians who are fleeing violence. Some of them are persecuted, and some of them are getting out of Dodge. They're getting out of a terrible situation. That's what these children are doing. I mean, the most amazing thing to me is that these are children. And we're responding to it with border security measures that, to me, don't seem appropriate. And I guess the other thing is with regards to trying to respond to them. Yes, I can see over time, that it's possible to develop some in-country programs, but the problems of the countries we're talking about in the Northern Triangle that we're dealing with, they're semi-failing states. That is, they don't have control over their territories complete enough to be able to even help run that sort of program. And that's why I think Secretary Johnson has not seen a lot of development from that for the moment. So that's a quick few minutes, but I want to give more. Thank you for the question, Doris. I hope that helps other people start thinking about this in different ways as well. Mark, you have a question. Thanks. I don't want to cut you off.
Mark Rosenblum from MPI. It's a question partly for Maureen and partly for Reyna. When I've looked at the numbers, I'm struck by the fact that the number of Honduran both children and family units are down this year by like 60 or 70%, and then Guatemalans are down by 20%. And I'm wondering, on one hand, how much of that is driven by Hondurans and Salvadorans claiming to be Guatemalans so that they have an easier time, reattempting? Or, Maureen, have you seen changes that the situation in Guatemala has deteriorated so much this year, and that Honduras is improving, and or the Honduran enforcement efforts are preventing people from leaving? I wonder if we can tease out what's different about the countries in the region.
Do you want to go first?
I think it's hard to get the exact, what's the main reason why the different countries shift. I do think Guatemala has seen very interesting developments in the past year. Obviously, the past few months where you've had a president resign due to corruption allegations, the vice president. I mean, there's a lot of elections just happened. I think it's also important to distinguish in terms of there is a large population that needs protection and should be considered refugees. There are still other migrant or people that are leaving for economic reasons. And if you look at particularly Guatemala or the kind of overall drought, the coffee blight, there's a lot of other factors that are leading to part of the population leaving. It's not just the violence. And I think if you're in the Guatemalan highlands and your family's dying of hunger, I think there are other reasons that drive certain populations to leave as well. And I think that could help explain some of the numbers. It's kind of hard to know the exact. I mean, Honduras, again, the homicide numbers are down. Not quite sure how much is a different data collection or if it really is different. Honduras, and it actually has some interesting discussions with the OAS on looking at better ways to address impunity and institutional crisis in Honduras. Not quite sure where that will go, but they are, starting to work in these discussions. So there's different things happening in the region. I think it is clear that, particularly El Salvador with the homicides, it is the country that has seen the most dramatic shift in terms of violence if you look at the three Northern Triangle countries.
I don't have a clear answer for you, Mark. I think several factors could be in place to explain this change. And actually, perhaps the public campaigns may have played a role, added to all what Maureen just said. I know that the Northern Triangle countries launch intensive public campaigns to pass information on the dangers of, migrating under certain conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So perhaps that could be part of the answer.
And I'm going to close with another final thought with Doris' stimulating question, and that is one of the complexities of the movement of the unaccompanied children from the Northern Triangle countries to the United States is what was revealed once again from a U.S. government official who was talking about who was coming. And of course, they were interviewing the children to find out who was here in the United States. So who was here? I was told 50% of those children who were interviewed as of early July of 2014, as those numbers had increased, had a parent, at least one parent in the United States. 35% had some other close relative in the United States. That's 85% had a relative here, a close enough relative here. Part of the complexity is about U.S. policy. And I'll now call it immigration reform, recognizing Cesar's challenges. Okay, any final comments from our panelists?
If I may, Andrew,
Please.
Final thoughts triggered by Doris' question. Certainly, as I said at the beginning, we're trying to think in terms of shared responsibility. Now that we are working in the improvement of our mechanisms to grant refuge in Mexico, we're going to need, for example, the help of the U.S. in terms of what about if we detect cases in which those children may have a legitimate claim for family reunification in the U.S.? Are we going to send them back to El Salvador to ask for in-country processing? So this is something that we're going to talk with our counterparts here. What mechanisms are we going to put in place to do this? And I really, perhaps because I'm not a lawyer, I think in terms of policies and politics, we need to remember that there is another component in all this. We can perfect our mechanisms in which we grant refuge or protect these minors, in which we address our cooperation at the border to improve infrastructure and better, you have better tools like the protocols that I mentioned. But at the same time, we need to go to the roots of what is causing this. And we talk about challenges that these countries have, including Mexico, including the U.S., of course. And what you mentioned, for example, asking for a more active role of UNHCR, that I think that you refer also here in the U.S., because at some point last year we could have thought that in the shelters that the Border Patrol were not able to handle the amounts of flows that they were receiving. So perhaps there's a role for the UNHCR all over the region, not only in Central America and Mexico, but also in the U.S. So we need to think in those terms. And we need to go back to the roots of these causes. We need to, for the first time, I have to say, I've heard high-level U.S. authorities to link the issue of migration with development, and Doris Meisner is the expert here. It's very difficult to have that combination and to have someone publicly talk about the need for development as one of the multidimensional answers to the migration issue. So we need to talk more about that.
Excellent. Any other final comments? Please join me in thanking our panelists for a stimulating discussion.